Chapter 7. The Secret of the Ruin. In the yard behind the granary near the bathhouse stood a ruin in which many years before Roisatemeral's parents had lived. Unoccupied now, its ground-floor windows were boarded, but on the second floor there were still a few well-preserved rooms. Pigeons perched on the roof, and swallows had nested under the gutter. A worn broom had been stuck in the chimney. Nathan had often said the building should be razed, but Roisatemeral had insisted that while she was alive, her parents' home would not be demolished. The attic was littered with old rubbish and rags. Schoolboys said that a light emanated from the ruin at midnight, and that demons lived in the cellar. Roisatemeral led Nathan there now. It was not easy to enter the ruin. Weeds that pricked and burned obstructed the path. Roisatemeral's skirt caught on thorns sharp as nails. Little molehills were everywhere. A heavy curtain of cobwebs barred the open doorway. Roisatemeral swept them away with a rotten branch. The stairs were rickety. Her legs were heavy, and she had to lean on Nathan's arm. A thick cloud of dust arose, and Nathan began to sneeze and cough. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, bewildered. "Don't be afraid," Roisatemeral said. "It's all right." Leaving him in the ruin, she returned to the house. She told the servant to take the rest of the day off, and the servant did not have to be told twice. When she had gone, Roisatemeral opened the cabinets that were still filled with Nathan's clothes, took his linen from the chest, and brought everything to the ruin. Once more she left, and when she returned it was with a basket containing a meal of rice and pot roast, tripe with calves' feet, white bread, and stewed prunes. After he had gobbled his supper and licked off the prune plate, Roisatemeral drew a bucket of water from the well and told him to go to another room to wash. Night was falling, but the twilight lingered a long time. Nathan did as Roisatemeral instructed, and she could hear him splash and sigh in the next room. Then he changed his clothes. When Roisatemeral saw him, tears streamed from her eyes. The full moon that shone through the window made the room bright as daylight, and Nathan, in a clean shirt, his dressing gown embroidered with leaves and flowers, in his silken cap and velvet slippers, once again seemed his former self. Marcia Mecherlis happened to be out of town, and Roisatemeral was in no hurry. She went again to the house and returned with bedding. The bed only needed to be fitted with boards. Not wanting to light a candle, lest someone notice the glow, Roisatemeral went about in the dark, climbed to the attic with Nathan, and groped until she found some old slats for the bed. Then she placed a mattress, sheets, and a pillow on it. She had even remembered to bring some jam and a box of cookies, so that Nathan could refresh himself before going to sleep. Only then did she sit down on the unsteady stool to rest. Nathan sat on the edge of the bed. After a long silence he said, "What's the use? Tomorrow I must leave." "Why tomorrow?" said Roisatemeral. "Rest up. There's always time to rot in the poorhouse." Late into the night they sat, talking, murmuring. Roisatemeral cried and stopped crying, began again and was calm again. She insisted that Nathan confess everything to her without omitting details. And he told her again how he had met Shifra, how they had married, how she had persuaded him to go with her to Pressburg, and how she had spent the night full of sweet talk and love play with him at an inn. And at daybreak, when he fell asleep, she had arisen and untied the bag from his neck. He also told Roisatemeral how he had been forced to discard all shame, to sleep in beggars' dormitories and eat at strangers' tables. Although his story angered her, and she called him blockhead, stupid fool, ass, idiot, her heart almost dissolved with pity. "What is there to do now?" she kept murmuring to herself over and over again. And I, the evil spirit, answered, "Don't let him go. The beggar's life is not for him. He might die of grief or shame." And when Roisatemeral argued that because she was a married woman she had no right to stay with him, I said, "Can the 12 lines of a bill of divorcement separate two souls who have been fused by 50 years of common life? Can a brother and sister be transformed by law into strangers? Hasn't Nathan become part of you? Don't you see him every night in your dreams? Isn't all your fortune the result of his industry and effort? And what is Moshe Michaelis? A stranger, a lout. Wouldn't it be better to fry with Nathan in hell rather than serve as Moshe Michaelis's footstool in heaven? I also recalled to her an incident in a storybook where a landowner whose wife had eloped with a bear tamer later forgave her and took her back to his manor. When the clock in the Frampol church chimed 11, Rosa Temerol returned home. In her luxurious canopied bed, she tossed like one in a fever. For a long time, Nathan stood beside his window looking out. The Elul sky was full of stars. The owl on the roof of the synagogue screeched with a human voice. The caterwauling of cats reminded him of women in labor. Crickets chirped, and unseen saws seemed to be buzzing through tree trunks. The neighing of horses that had grazed all night came through the fields with the calls of shepherds. Nathan, because he stood on an upper floor, could see the whole little town at a glance: the synagogue, the church, the slaughterhouse, the public bathhouse, the market, and the side streets where Gentiles lived. He recognized each shed, shack, and board in his own yard. A goat stripped some bark from a tree. A field mouse left the granary to return to its nest. Nathan watched for a long time. Everything about him was familiar and yet strange, real and ghostly, as though he were no longer among the living. Only his spirit floated there. He recalled that there was a Hebrew phrase which applied to him, but he could not remember it exactly. Finally, after trying for a long time, he remembered: one who sees without being seen. Chapter 8. One who sees without being seen. In Frampol, the rumor spread that Rosa Temerol, having quarreled with her maid, had dismissed her in the middle of her term. This surprised the housewives, because the girl was reputedly industrious and honest. Actually, Rosa Temerol had dismissed the girl to keep her from discovering that Nathan lived in the ruin. As always, when I seduced sinners, I persuaded the couple that all this was provisional, that Nathan would stay only until he had recovered from his wandering. But I made certain that Rosa Temerol welcomed the presence of her hidden guest, and that Nathan enjoyed being where he was. Even though they discussed their future separation each time they were together, Rosa Temerol gave Nathan's quarters an air of permanency. She resumed her cooking and frying for him, and once more brought him her tasty dishes. After a few days, Nathan's appearance changed remarkably. From pastries and puddings, his face became pink again, and once more, like that of a man of wealth, his paunch protruded. Once more he wore embroidered shirts, velvet slippers, silken dressing gowns, and carried batiste handkerchiefs. To keep him from being bored by his idleness, Rosa Temerol brought him a Bible in Yiddish, a copy of The Inheritance of the Deer, and numerous storybooks. She even managed to procure some tobacco for his pipe, for he enjoyed smoking one, and she brought from the cellar bottles of wine and mead that Nathan had stored for years. The divorced couple had banquets in the ruin. I made certain that Moshe Michaelis was seldom at home. I sent him to all kinds of fairs, and even recommended him as arbiter in disputes. It did not take long for the ruin behind the granary to become Rosa Temerol's only comfort. Just as a miser's thoughts constantly dwell on the treasure he has buried far from sight, so Rosa Temerol thought only of the ruin and the secret in her heart. Sometimes she thought that Nathan had died, and she had magically resurrected him for a while. At other times, she imagined the whole thing was a dream. Whenever she looked out of her window at the moss-covered roof of the ruin, she thought, "No, it's inconceivable for Nathan to be there. I must be deluded." And immediately she had to fly there, up the rickety stairs, to be met halfway by Nathan in person, with his familiar smile and his pleasant odor. "Nathan, you're here?" she would ask, and he would respond, "Yes, Rosa Temerol, I'm here and waiting for you." "Have you missed me?" she would ask, and he would answer, "Of course. When I hear your step, it's a holiday for me." "Nathan, Nathan," she would continue, "would you have believed a year ago that it would end like this?" And he would murmur, "No, Rosa Temerol, it is like a bad dream." "Oh, Nathan, We have already lost this world, and I'm afraid we'll lose the other also, Roisatemerl said. And he replied, Well, that's too bad. But hell, too, is for people, not for dogs. Since Moshe Mechelis belonged to the Hasidim, I, old rebel, sent him to spend the days of awe with his rabbi. Alone, Roisatemerl bought Nathan a prayer shawl, a white robe, a prayer book, and prepared a holiday meal for him. Since on Rosh Hashanah there is no moon, he ate the evening meal in darkness, blindly dunked a slice of bread in honey, and tasted an apple, a carrot, the head of a carp, and offered a blessing for the first fruit over a pomegranate. He stood praying during the day in his robe and prayer shawl. The sound of the ram's horn came faintly to his ears from the synagogue. At the intermission between the prayers, Roisatemerl visited him in her golden dress, her white satin-lined coat, and the shawl embroidered with silver threads, to wish him a happy new year. The golden chain he had given her for their betrothal hung around her neck. A brooch he had brought to her from Danzig quivered on her breast, and from her wrist dangled a bracelet he had bought her at Brody. She exuded an aroma of honey cake and the women's section of the synagogue. On the evening before the Day of Atonement, Roisatemerl brought him a white rooster as a sacrificial victim, and prepared for him the meal to be eaten before commencing the fast. Also, she gave the synagogue a wax candle for his soul. Before leaving for the mincha prayer at the synagogue, she came to bid him goodbye, and she began to lament so loudly that Nathan feared she would be heard. Falling into his arms, she clung to him and would not be torn away. She drenched his face with tears and howled as though possessed. "Nathan, Nathan," she wailed, "may we have no more unhappiness," and other things that are said when a member of a family dies, repeating them many times. Fearing she might faint and fall, Nathan had to escort her downstairs. Then, standing at the window, he watched the people of Frampol on their way to the synagogue. The women walked quickly and vigorously, as though hurrying to pray for someone on his deathbed. They held up their skirts, and when two of them met, they fell into each other's arms and swayed back and forth, as if in some mysterious struggle. Wives of prominent citizens knocked at doors of poor people and begged to be forgiven. Mothers whose children were ill ran with arms outstretched as though chasing someone, crying like madwomen. Elderly men, before leaving home, removed their shoes, put on white robes, prayer shawls, and white skull caps. In the synagogue yard, the poor sat with alms boxes on benches. A reddish glow spread over the roofs, reflecting in the window panes and illuminating pale faces. In the west, the sun grew enormous. Clouds around it caught fire, until half the sky was suffused with flames. Nathan recalled the river of fire in which all souls must cleanse themselves. The sun sank soon below the horizon. Girls dressed in white came outside and carefully closed shutters. Little flames played on the high windows of the synagogue, and inside the entire building seemed to be one great flicker. A muted hum arose from it, and bursts of sobbing. Removing his shoes, Nathan wrapped himself in his shawl and robe. Half reading and half remembering, he chanted the words of Kol Nidre, the song that is recited not only by the living but by the dead in their graves. What was he, Nathan Yosefover, but a dead man who, instead of resting in his grave, wandered about in a world that did not exist? Chapter 9. Footprints in the Snow. The high holidays were over. Winter had come. But Nathan was still in the ruin. It could not be heated, not only because the stove had been dismantled, but because smoke coming from the chimney would make people suspicious. To keep Nathan from freezing, Roisatemerl provided him with warm clothes and a coal pot. At night he covered himself with 2 feather quilts. During the day he wore his fox fur and had felt boots on his feet. Roisatemerl also brought him a little barrel of spirits with a straw in it, which he sipped each time he felt cold, while eating a piece of dried mutton. From the rich food with which Roisatemerl plied him, he grew fat and heavy. In the evenings he stood at the window watching with curiosity the women who went to the ritual bath. On market days he never left the window. Carts drove into the yard, and peasants unloaded sacks of grain. Moshe Mechelis, in a cotton-padded jacket, ran back and forth, crying out hoarsely. Although it pained Nathan to think that this ridiculous fellow disposed of his possessions and lay with his wife, Moshe Mechelis's appearance made him laugh, as though the whole thing were a kind of prank that he, Nathan, had played on his competitor. Sometimes he felt like calling to him, "Hey there, Moshe Mechelis," while throwing him a bit of plaster or a bone. As long as there was no snow, Nathan had everything he needed. Rosa Temerel visited him often. At night, Nathan would go out for a walk on a path that led to the river. But one night a great deal of snow fell, and the next day Rosa Temerel did not visit him, for she was afraid someone might notice her tracks in the snow. Nor could Nathan go out to satisfy his natural needs. For 2 days he had nothing warm to eat, and the water in the pail turned to ice. On the 3rd day, Rosa Temerel hired a peasant to clear the snow between the house and the granary, and she also told him to clear the snow between the granary and the ruin. Moshe Mechelis, when he came home, was surprised and asked why, but she changed the subject, and since he suspected nothing, he soon forgot about it. Nathan's life from then on became increasingly difficult. After each new snowfall, Rosa Temerel cleared the path with a shovel. To keep her neighbors from seeing what went on in the yard, she had the fence repaired. And as a pretext for going to the ruin, she had a ditch for refuse dug close to it. Whenever she saw Nathan, he said it was time for him to take his bundle and leave. But Rosa Temerel prevailed on him to wait. "Where will you go?" she asked. "You might, God forbid, drop from exhaustion." According to the almanac, she argued, the winter would be a mild one, and summer would begin early, weeks before Purim, and he only had to get through half the month of Kislev, besides Tevet and Shevat. She told him other things. At times they did not even speak, but sat silently, holding hands and weeping. Both of them were actually losing strength each day. Nathan grew fatter, more blown up. His belly was full of wind. His legs seemed leaden, and his sight was dimming. He could no longer read his storybooks. Rosa Temerel grew thin, like a consumptive, lost her appetite, and could not sleep. Some nights she lay awake sobbing, and when Moshe Mechelis asked her why, she said it was because she had no children to pray for her after she was gone. One day a downpour washed away the snow. Since Rosa Temerel had not visited the ruin for 2 days, Nathan expected her to arrive at any moment. He had no food left. Only a bit of brandy remained at the bottom of the barrel. For hours on end he stood waiting for her at the window, which was misted over with frost, but she did not come. The night was pitch black and icy. Dogs barked, a wind blew. The walls of the ruin shook. A whistling sound ran through the chimney, and the eaves rattled on the roof. In Nathan's house, now the house of Moshe Mechelis, several lamps seemed to have been lighted. It seemed extraordinarily bright, and the light made the surrounding darkness thicker. Nathan thought he heard the rolling of wheels, as though a carriage had driven to the house. In the darkness, someone drew water from the well, and someone poured out the slops. The night wore on, but despite the late hour, the shutters remained open. Seeing shadows run back and forth, Nathan thought important visitors might have come and were being treated to a banquet. He remained staring into the night until his knees grew weak, and with his last bit of strength he dragged himself to his bed and fell into a deep sleep. The cold awoke him early next morning. With stiff limbs he arose and barely propelled himself to the window. More snow had fallen during the night, and a heavy frost had set in. To his amazement, Nathan saw a group of men and women standing around his house. He wondered anxiously what was going on, but he did not have to wonder long, for suddenly the door swung open, and 4 men carried out a coffin hearse covered with a black cloth. Moshe Mechelis is dead, Nathan thought, but then he saw Moshe Mechelis following the coffin. It was not he, but Rosa Temerel who had died. Nathan could not weep. It was as though the cold had frozen his tears. Trembling and shaking, he watched the men carrying the coffin, watched the beadle rattling his alms box and the mourners wading through deep snowdrifts. The sky, pale as linen, hung low, meeting the blanketed earth. As though drifting on a flood, the trees in the field seemed to be afloat in whiteness. From his window, Nathan could see all the way to the cemetery. The coffin moved up and down, the crowd following it, thinned out and at times vanished entirely, seemed to sink into the ground and then emerge again. Nathan fancied for a moment that the cortege had stopped and no longer advanced, and then that the people as well as the corpse were moving backward. The cortege grew gradually smaller until it became a black dot. Because the dot ceased to move, Nathan realized that the pallbearers had reached the cemetery, and that he was watching his faithful wife being buried. With the remaining brandy, he washed his hands, for the water in his pail had turned to ice, and he began to murmur the prayer for the dead. Chapter 10. Nathan had intended to pack his things and leave during the night, but I, the chief of the devils, prevented him from carrying out his plan. Before sunrise, he was seized with powerful stomach cramps. His head grew hot, and his knees so weak that he could not walk. His shoes had grown brittle. He could not put them on, and his legs had become fat. The good spirit counseled him to call for help, to shout until people heard and came to rescue him, because no man may cause his own death. But I said to him, "Do you remember the words of King David? Let me rather fall into God's hands than into the hands of people." You don't want Moshe Mechelis and his henchmen to have the satisfaction of revenging themselves on you and jeering. Rather die like a dog. In short, he listened to me first because he was proud, and second because he was not fated to be buried according to law. Gathering together his last remnants of strength, he pushed his bed to the window to lie there and watch. He fell asleep early and awoke. There was day, and then night. Sometimes he heard cries in the yard. At other times he thought someone called him by name. His head, he fancied, had grown monstrously large and burdensome, like a millstone carried on his neck. His fingers were wooden, his tongue hard. It seemed bigger than the space it occupied. My helpers, goblins, appeared to him in dreams. They screamed, whistled, kindled fires, walked on stilts, and carried on like Purim players. He dreamed of floods, then of fires, imagined the world had been destroyed, and then that he hovered in the void with bat's wings. In his dreams he also saw pancakes, dumplings, broad noodles with cheese, and when he awoke his stomach was as full as though he had actually eaten. He belched and sighed, and touched his belly that was empty and aching all over. Once, sitting up, he looked out of the window, and saw to his surprise that people were walking backward, and marveled at this. Soon he saw other extraordinary things. Among those who passed, he recognized men who had long been dead. Do my eyes deceive me, he wondered, or has Messiah come, and has he resurrected the dead? The more he looked, the more astonished he became. Entire generations passed through the town, men and women with packs on their shoulders and staffs in their hands. He recognized among them his father and grandfather, his grandmothers and great-aunts. He watched workers build the Frampol synagogue. They carried bricks, sawed wood, mixed plaster, nailed on eaves. Schoolboys stood about, staring upward and calling a strange word he could not understand, like something in a foreign tongue. As in a dance around the Torah, 2 storks circled the building. Then the building and builders vanished, and he saw a group of people, barefooted, bearded, wild-eyed, with crosses in their hands, lead a Jew to the gallows. Though the black-bearded young man cried heart-rendingly, they dragged him on, tied in ropes. Bells were ringing. The people in the streets ran away and hid. It was midday, but it grew dark as the day of an eclipse of the sun. Finally, the young man cried out, "Shema Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," and was left hanging, his tongue lolling out. His legs swayed for a long time, and hosts of crows flew overhead, cawing hoarsely. On his last night, Nathan dreamed that Rosa Temerel and Shifra Tzirel were one woman with 2 faces. He was overjoyed at her appearance. "Why have I not noticed this before?" he wondered. "Why did I have to go through this trouble and anxiety?" He kissed the 2-faced female, and she returned his kisses with her doubled lips, pressing against him her 2 pairs of breasts. He spoke words of love to her. and she responded in 2 voices. In her 4 arms and 2 bosoms, all his questions were answered. There was no longer life and death, here nor there, beginning nor end. The truth is twofold, Nathan exclaimed. This is the mystery of all mysteries. Without a last confession of his sins, Nathan died that night. I at once transported his soul to the nether abyss. He still wanders to this day in desolate spaces, and has not yet been granted admittance to hell. Moshe Mechelis married again, a young woman this time. She made him pay dearly, soon inherited his fortune and squandered it. Shifrat Cyril became a harlot in Pressburg and died in the poorhouse. The ruin still stands as before, and Nathan's bones still lie there. And who can tell, perhaps another man, who sees without being seen, is hiding in it. Translated by Norbert Guttermann and Elaine Gottlieb. The Man Who Came Back. You may not believe it, but there are people in the world who were called back. I myself knew such a one in our town of Turbin, a rich man. He was taken with a mortal illness. The doctors said a lump of fat had formed under his heart. God forbid it should happen to any of us. He made a journey to the hot springs to draw off the fat, but it didn't help. His name was Alter, and his wife's name was Shifra Leah. I can see them both, as if they were standing right before my eyes. She was lean as a stick, all skin and bones, and black as a spade. He was short and fair, with a round paunch and a small round beard. A rich man's wife, but she wore a pair of broken-down clodhoppers and a shawl thrown over her head, and was forever looking out for bargains. When she heard of a village where one could pick up cheap a measure of corn or a pot of buckwheat, she would go all the way on foot and haggle there with the peasant until he let her have it for next to nothing. I beg her pardon, but the family she came from was scum. He was a lumber merchant, a partner in the sawmill. Half the town bought their lumber from him. Unlike his wife, he was fond of good living, dressing like a count, always in a short coat and fine leather boots. You could count each hair in his beard, it was so carefully combed and brushed. He liked a good meal, too. His old woman stinted on everything for herself, but for him no delicacy was too dear. Because he favored rich broths with circlets of fat floating on top, she bullied the butcher, demanding fat meat with a marrow bone thrown in for her husband's broth with the gold coins in it, as she explained. In my time, when people got married, they loved each other. Who ever thought of divorce? But this Shifra Leah was so wrapped up in her altar that people laughed in their fists. My husband this and my husband that, heaven and earth and altar. They had no children, and it's well known that when a woman is childless, she turns all her love on her husband. The doctor said he was to blame, but who can be sure about such things? Well, to make the story short, the man took sick and it looked bad. The biggest doctors came to see him. It didn't help. He lay in bed and sank from day to day. He still ate well, she feeding him roast pigeons and marzipans and all sorts of other delicacies, but his strength was ebbing away. One day I came to bring him a prayer book that my father, rest in peace, had sent over to him. There he lay on the sofa in a green dressing gown and white socks, a handsome figure. He looked healthy, except that his paunch was blown up like a drum, and when he spoke he puffed and he panted. He took the prayer book from me and gave me a cookie together with a pinch on the cheek. A day or two later the news was that Alter was dying. The menfolk gathered. The burial society waited at the door. Well, listen to what happened. When she saw that Alter was at his final gasp, Shifra Leah ran for the doctor. But by the time she got back with the doctor in tow, there was Leitzer Godel, the elder of the burial society, holding a feather to her Alter's nostrils. It was all over. They were ready to lift him off the bed, as the custom is. The instant Shifra Leah took it in, she flew into a frenzy. God help us, her screaming and wailing could be heard at the edge of the town. "Beasts! Murderers! Thugs! Out of my house! He'll live! He'll live!" She seized a broom and began to lay about her. Everybody thought she had gone out of her mind. She knelt by the corpse. "Don't leave me. Take me with you." And ranting and raving, she shook and jostled him with lamentations louder than those you'd hear on Yom Kippur. You know you are not allowed to shake a corpse, and they tried to restrain her, but she threw herself prone on the dead man and screeched into his ear, "Alter, wake up! Alter! Alter!" A living man couldn't have stood it. His eardrums would have burst. They were just making a move to pull her away when suddenly the corpse stirred and let out a deep sigh. She had called him back. You should know that when a person dies, his soul does not go up to heaven at once. It flutters at the nostrils and longs to enter the body again. It's so used to being there. If someone screams and carries on, it may take fright and fly back in, but it seldom remains long, because it cannot stay inside a body ruined by disease. But once in a great while it does, and when that happens, you have a person who was called back. Oh, it's forbidden. When the time comes for a man to die, he should die. Besides, one who has been called back is not like other men. He wanders about, as the saying goes, between worlds. He is here, and yet he isn't here. He would be better off in the grave. Still the man breathes and eats. He can even live with his wife. Only one thing, he casts no shadow. They say there was a man once in Lublin who had been called back. He sat all day in the prayer house and never said a word for 12 years. He did not even recite the Psalms. When he died at last, all that was left of him was a sack of bones. He had been rotting all those years, and his flesh had turned to dust. Not much was left to bury. Alter's case was different. He immediately began to recover, talking and wisecracking as if nothing had happened. His belly shrank, and the doctor said that the fat was gone from his heart. All Turbin was agog, people even coming from other towns to get a look at him. There was muttering that the burial society put living men into the ground, for if it was possible to call Alter back, then why not others? Perhaps others were also merely cataleptic. Shifralea soon drove everyone away. She allowed no one to enter her house, not even the doctor. She kept the door locked and the curtains drawn, while she tended and watched over her Alter. A neighbor reported he was already sitting up, taking food and drink, and even looking into his account books. Well, my dear people, it wasn't a month before he showed up at the marketplace with his cane and his pampered beard and his shiny boots. Folks greeted him, gathering round and wishing him health, and he answered, "So, you thought you were rid of me, eh? Not so soon. Plenty of water will yet run under the bridge before I go." People asked, "What happened after you stopped breathing?" And he said, "I ate of the Leviathan and dipped it in mustard." He was always ready with the usual wisecrack. It was said that the rabbi summoned him, and they were locked up together in the judgment chamber, but no one ever knew what talk passed between them. Anyhow, it was Alter, only now he had a nickname, the one who was called back. He was soon back at his trading in boards and logs. The gravediggers' brethren went about with long faces. They had hoped to pick up a juicy bone at the funeral. At first, people were a bit afraid of him. But what was there to be afraid of? He was the same merchant. His illness had cost quite a sum, but he had enough left over. On Saturdays he came to prayer. He was called to the reading, offered thanksgiving. He was also expected to contribute to the poorhouse and to give a feast for the townsfolk, but Alter played dumb. As for his wife, Shifralea, she strutted like a peacock, looking down her nose at everyone. A small matter? She had brought a dead man back to life. Ours was quite a big town. Other men fell ill, and other wives tried to call them back, but no one had a mouth like hers. If everybody could be recalled, the angel of death would have to put aside his sword. Well, things took a turn. Alter had a partner in his mill, Falik Weingarten. In those days, people were not called by their family names, but Falik was a real aristocrat. One day, Falik came to the rabbi with a queer story. Alter, his partner, had become a swindler. He stole money from the partnership. He pulled all sorts of tricks and was trying to push him, Falik, out of the business. The rabbi couldn't believe it. When a man had gone through such an ordeal, would he suddenly become a crook? It didn't stand to reason. But Falik was not one to make up tales, and they sent for Alter. He went into a song and dance. Black was white, and white was black. He dug up ancient bills and accounts all the way back from King Sobietsky's time. He showed bundles of claims. To hear him tell it, his partner still owed him a small fortune, and what's more, he threatened to start court action. The townspeople tried arguing with Alter. "You've done business together for so many years. What's gone wrong all of a sudden?" But Alter was a changed man. He seemed to be looking for quarrels. He started litigation, and the case dragged on and cost a fortune. Frolic took it so to heart that he died. Who won, I don't remember. I only remember that the sawmill went over to creditors, and Frolics' widow was left penniless. The rabbi rebuked Alter. "Is this how you thank the Lord for putting you back on your feet and raising you from the dead?" Alter's answer was no better than the barking of a dog. "It was not God who did it, it was Shifra Leah." And he said further, "There is no other world. I was good and dead, and I can tell you there is nothing. No hell and no paradise." The rabbi decided he had lost his mind. Perhaps so. But wait, hear the rest. His wife Shifra Leah was the worst kind of draggle-tail. People said that a pile of dirt sprang up wherever she stood. Suddenly Alter began to demand that she should dress up, deck herself out. "A wife's place," he said, "is not only under the quilt. I want you to go promenading with me on Lublin Street." The whole town buzzed. Shifra Leah ordered a new cotton dress made, and on Sabbath afternoon, after the Cholent meal, there were Alter and his wife Shifra Leah on the promenade, along with the tailor's helpers and shoemaker's apprentices. It was a sight. Whoever had the use of his limbs ran out to look. Alter even trimmed his beard. He became, an atheist. Nowadays they're all over the place. Every fool puts on a short jacket and shaves his chin. But in my time, we had only one atheist, the apothecary. People began to say that when Shifra Leah called Alter back with her screams, the soul of a stranger had entered his body. Souls come flying when someone dies, souls of kinsfolk and others, and who knows, evil souls too, ready to take possession. Reb Aryeh Vishnitzer, a pupil of the old rabbi, declared that Alter was no longer Alter. True, it was not the same Alter. He talked differently, he laughed differently, he looked at you differently. His eyes were like a hawk's, and when he stared at a woman it was enough to make a shudder pass through you. He hung out with the musicians and all sorts of riffraff. At first his wife said amen to everything. Whatever Alter said or did was all right with her. I beg her pardon, but she was a cow. But then a certain female arrived in our town from Warsaw. She came to visit her sister, who wasn't much to boast of, and whose husband was a barber. On market days he shaved the peasants, and he also bled them. You can expect anything from such people. He had a cage full of birds, twittering all day long, and he also had a dog. His own wife had never shaved off her hair, and the sister from Warsaw was a divorcee. No one knew who her husband was. She came among us bedecked and bejeweled, but whoever looked at her twice? A broomstick can be dressed up, too. She showed the women the long stockings she was wearing, hooks, if you'll pardon the word, to her drawers. It was not hard to guess that she had come to trap some man. And who do you think fell into her clutches? Alter. When the townsfolk heard that Alter was running around with the barber's sister-in-law, they couldn't believe it. Even coopers and skinners in those days had some regard for decency, but Alter was a changed man. God forbid he had lost all shame. He strolled with the divorcee in the marketplace, and people looked from all the windows, shaking their heads and spitting in disgust. He went with her to the tavern, for all the world like a peasant with his woman. There they sat in the middle of the week, guzzling wine. When Shifra Leah heard it, she knew she was in trouble. She came running to the tavern, but her husband turned on her with the vilest abuse. The newcomer, the slut, also jeered at her and taunted her. Shifra Leah tried to appeal to him. "Have you no shame before the world? The world can kiss what we sit on," says he. Shifra Leah cried to the other one, "He is my husband." "Mine also," answers she. The tavern keeper tried to put a word in, but Alter and the slut belabored him too. A woman depraved is worse than the worst man. She opened such a mouth that she shocked even the tavern keeper. People said she grabbed a pitcher and threw it at him. Turbin is not Warsaw. The town was in an uproar. The rabbi sent the sexton to summon Alter to him, but Alter refused to come. Then the community threatened him with the 3 letters of excommunication. It didn't help. He had connections with the authorities and defied one and all. After a couple of weeks, the divorced slut left town, and people thought things would quiet down. Before the week was out, the man who was called back from the dead came to his wife with a tale. He had an opportunity, he said, to buy a wood in Volhynia, an unusual bargain, and he must leave at once. He collected all his money and told Shifra that he had to pawn her jewelry, too. He bought a barouche and 2 horses. People suspected he was up to something crooked and warned his wife, but the faith she had in him, he could have been a wonder rabbi. She packed his suits and underwear, roasted chickens, and prepared jams for him for the journey. Just before he set off, he handed her a small box. In here, he said, are 3 promissory notes. On Thursday, 8 days from today, take the notes to the rabbi. The money was left with him. He spun her a story, and she swallowed it. Then he was off. Thursday, 8 days later, she opened the box and discovered a writ of divorce. She let out a scream and fell into a faint. When she came to, she ran to the rabbi, but he took one look at the paper and said, "There is nothing to be done. A writ of divorce can be hung on your doorknob, or it can be slipped under your door." You can imagine what went on in Turbin that day. Shifra pulled at her cheeks, screaming, "Why didn't I let him croak? May he drop dead wherever he is!" He had cleaned her out. Even her holiday kerchief was gone. The house was there still, but it was mortgaged to the barber. In olden times, runners would have been sent after such a shameless betrayer. The Jews once had power and authority, and there was a pillory in the synagogue court to which a wretch would have been bound. But among our Gentile officials, a Jew was of small consequence. They couldn't care less. Besides, Alter had taken care to bribe his way. Well, Shifra took sick, climbed into her bed, and refused to get up. She would take nothing to eat and kept cursing him with the deadliest curses. Then suddenly she started beating her breast and lamenting, "It's all my fault. I did not do enough to please him." She wept and she laughed. She was like one possessed by an evil spirit. The barber, who claimed now to be the legal owner of the house, wanted to throw her out of her home, but the community wouldn't let him, and she remained in a room in the attic. In time, after a few weeks, she recovered, and she went out with a peddler's pack like a man to trade among the peasants. She turned out to be a good hand at buying and selling. Soon, the matchmakers were approaching her with proposals of marriage. She wouldn't hear of it. All she talked about, she bent your ear if you would listen, was her altar. "You wait," she said, "he'll come back to me." The other one didn't want him. She was after his money. "She'll clean him out and leave him flat." "And you'd take such riffraff back again?" folks asked her, to which she answered, "Only let him come. I'll wash his feet and drink the water." She still had a trunk left, and she collected linens and woolens like a bride. "This will be my dowry for when he returns," she boasted. "I'll marry him again." Nowadays you call it infatuation. We called it plumb crazy. Whenever people came from the big cities, she ran to them, "Have you run into my altar?" But no one had seen him. It was rumored that he had become an apostate. Some said he had married a she-demon. Such things happen. The years went by, and people began to think that Alter would never be heard of again. One Sabbath afternoon, when Shifra was dozing on her bench bed, she had never learned to read the Holy Book as the women do, the door opened, and in stepped a soldier. He took out a sheet of paper. "Are you Shifra, the wife of the scoundrel Alter?" She turned white as chalk. She could not understand Russian, and an interpreter was brought in. Well, Alter was in prison, a serious crime, because he was sentenced to life. He was being kept in the Lublin jail, and he had managed to bribe the soldier, who was going home on leave, to bring a letter to Shifra. Who knows where Alter got the money to bribe in prison? He must have hidden it somewhere in his cot when he was first brought in. Those who read the letter said that it would have melted a stone. He wrote to his former wife, "Shifra, I have sinned against you. Save me, save me. I am going under. Death is better than such a life." The other one, the slut, the barber's sister-in-law, had stripped him of everything and left him only his shirt. She probably informed on him, too.